Recording now. Check. Okay. Peace and Black Power, mighty Africans. Welcome to our final addition to our hard teaching political education series. I am Conan Tandaji, the political education director for the African Black Coalition, ABC. Welcome. Thank you all for joining. Wherever you may find yourselves, hopefully you are well in mind, body, and spirit. We have a masterful topic and teacher in our virtual space. And we are certainly going to close out our hard teaching series, triumphantly, and in revolutionary spirit, right? In that spirit of Black August. So, without further ado, I would be honored to pass the mic to our guest teacher, our guest speaker, Sister Jada Johnson. She is the current Black Student Programs Director for the African Black Coalition. So Jada, the floor is yours. Introduce yourself. Let's get to learning.
All right. Hey everyone, my name is Jada Johnson, and today's topic is Afro-Caribbean women's resistance, and this is from a Pan-Caribbean exploration. So, Jada Johnson, I am a master's of education, but more importantly, I am an activist and educator and organizer, and I am focusing specifically on the Afro-Caribbean women's militancy and revolutionary consciousness, as well as their revolutionary participation. So you can type this in the chat box. I want to make this as interactive as possible, and don't Google this, right? Off the top of your head, if you were to guess a number, how many Caribbean nations are there throughout the Caribbean? Oh, okay. Got it. So we have 27 here. We have, and there has been some debate. So as of right now, there are 28 islands, and there are 28 islands because, and this is a bit controversial, but they have counted a private island owned by a private, of course, like billionaire as its own specific nation. However, there were 27 for quite some time. And so I wanted to show you all the Caribbean in relationship to the globe, and particularly in relationship to the United States, so that we can see its proximity. So as you can see, the yellow USA is right there, and then right underneath it, you'll see this little like wavy-ish line that connects from the US, or at least it looks like it connects from the United States down to South America, and that is the Caribbean. And I'll be using Caribbean, Greater and Lesser Antilles, and West Indies interchangeably. So just so you know, when I say those particular things, when I use those particular terms, I am speaking of the Caribbean islands. So Greater Antilles, these are the islands that we generally think of when we think of the Caribbean islands, or at least for most of us, right? We think of Cuba, we think of Jamaica, we think of Haiti or Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico, or even the Bahamas. However, there are several smaller islands that we oftentimes do not give a lot of love to, but have a very deep, rich, and beautiful history. So you'll see St. Martin on here twice, spelled a bit differently, depending on who colonized them. You have St. Kitts, you have Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, you have St. Lucia, you even have Grenada further on down, you have Aruba, you have Bermuda, which I do not see on here, but Bermuda is there. Maybe I'm missing it. But you have so many smaller islands, right? So we have 28 nations, and we have over 7,000 islands, some connected to each other, such as the Bahamas, right? And some that are just like one bigger island with maybe a smaller, tiny island attached to it below, like Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So Before we get started, I want to set the tone and let you all know that there are things that you should consider and things that I have taken into consideration throughout this presentation. The first thing is the Caribbean is not monolithic. And while I am exploring Caribbean women's revolutionary consciousness and participation through a pan-Caribbean lens, I also understand that Caribbean nations have their own histories, have their own experiences with colonization, and have their own unique backgrounds and nuances when it comes to enslavement, who colonized them, how many nations, how many colonizers colonized them, etc. Right? And similarly, politics are equally as complicated. So the politics on the individual islands were sometimes specific to that island, were sometimes shared amongst all of the islands, and sometimes even shared amongst those who were also colonized by the same entity. So for example, Haiti shares various similarities with Antigua because they were both colonized for a lengthy period of time by the French. Whereas you may see some drastic differences as well as some similarities between a place like the Dominican Republic and somewhere like Jamaica. The language of the time. So throughout this presentation, I will be using the language of the time, which can be, for some folks, a bit problematic. So I will use language such as mulatto, and for those who identify as biracial or multiracial, you may have a visceral reaction when you hear that term, right? When you hear the word mulatto, it may spark something within you because we understand that it has a very racist history. However, these are the ways in which these people were described, and sometimes, not all of the time, but sometimes these were the identities that the people themselves took on and embraced. And of course, accessibility and language barriers. Studying from the United States and being the product of the California's education system, I know English very well, and that is about it, right? So there are massive amounts of research and massive documentations and even various historians who speak various different languages. Some folks who speak French or Spanish or Portuguese or even Italian, right, who have studied these people, and due to the fact that I do not speak these languages, and of course, due to the fact that there may not be a translation for some of their documentations, my research can be at times limited. And Pan-Caribbean can have many contradictions. So throughout this, you will see some things that you may not necessarily agree with or understand, or you may see some things that kind of like juxtapose some of the other things that may be said or done, but recognize that Pan-Caribbean is an ideology. However, they are very different, right? And so what may have been normalized, what may have been okay somewhere like Barbados or Guadeloupe or Bermuda or Aruba, right, may not have always been like cohesive with one another. And then when we speak of Afro-Caribbean women in particular, the undocumented lives and contributions of these women are vast, right? There's limited research on many of the revolutions throughout the Caribbean islands. And for those, for the lives of women, we see sometimes, in some situations, in some instances, even less documentation. Various reasons for that. Colonizers may have destroyed those documents. Some things may have been lost in translation. And of course, I will be describing and detailing a particular time where people were not writing down the things that they did, but instead they were doing them, right? So some of their stories are undocumented, some parts of their lives are undocumented, and some of the things that they may have experienced and done is also undocumented. Trigger warning, of course, in order for me to discuss the lived experiences and the revolutionary consciousness of these women, we will have to understand and simultaneously address their traumas. I would do my absolute best to make sure that I am not going over or going into detail, the graphics, right, of things such as rape or violence, right, other forms of violence. But I do want you all to be, to understand that we cannot tell the stories of these women's lives without simultaneously telling the stories of what caused them to be the women that they became. And of course, true resistance will be violent in relationship to the trigger warning. Resistance and revolutions are inherently violent, right? So these women have done things, promoted things, advocated for things, and participated in things that were extremely violent. And you may not like all of their decisions. So there will be a few things that may seem a bit contradictory. Later on, we will learn about a woman who worked with the French, right, to defeat the British. And we may think, why would someone do that? We may think, why would you work with a former colonizer against a current colonizer, right? But I want us to be mindful that the lives of these women who lived in the 17 and the 1800s cannot be expressed through the terminology and the hindsight of us as people from the 21st century. So if you have any names for, if you know of any Afro-Caribbean revolutionary women, please leave them in the chat box. I want to see as we go through this if some of these women are mentioned. Of course, this is limited to an hour, so I will not go over a whole lot of women, but I will highlight a few women that you may be familiar with and some that you may not be. And so to set and place things into context, I am going to examine the ways in which Afro-Caribbean women sought liberation by way of revolutionary consciousness and actions in the Caribbean, right? And so I want us to understand that women, the Afro-Caribbean woman's positionality was that of dehumanization, right? She was not seen as a human, but instead an animalistic person who practiced animalistic spiritualities, that was sexually deviant, that was incapable of feeling pain, that was more masculine than feminine, more man than woman, right? And an incompetent and negligent mother. And all of these things will help us and assist us in understanding some of the actions of the colonizers and the ways that these women, tooth and nail, resisted these actions. So the proximity from whiteness, lastly, a Afro-Caribbean was on the complete opposite end of the spectrum from the quote unquote gentle sex, the white female, right? The white woman, the white feminine and demure and soft and kind, right? The African women were not granted the privilege of not working, right? The African woman was not presented with the privilege of not being able to care for her children, right? If they were not forcibly removed from her life. These were not the privileges, and these were not the frameworks or the positions in which the African woman lived in. So her proximity from both whiteness and femininity is as far on the spectrum as we can get. So the objectives of this presentation is to go over the resistance and the development of their revolutionary consciousness. And in this presentation, I am going to speak on the colonial enslaved Afro-Caribbean woman. So my specific focus for this particular presentation are women who lived between the mid 1750s to the early 1800s. And I'm going to touch on three particular things: resistance through spirituality, resistance through bodily autonomy, and resistance through militant leadership. So comparing and contrasting the United States and the experiences that the enslaved women in the United States experienced or underwent in comparison to Afro-Caribbeans. There are various overlaps here. There are so many similarities, but there are some differences. And I want us to make sure that we understand that as we move through this presentation. So the Caribbean island during colonial slavery was overwhelmingly Black. Whereas here in the States, and particularly in the South, you had a large population of African American or enslaved Africans, right? But that percentage was never larger than the number of whites that lived in that particular territory or state or region, right? So many of the islands were 90% or more Black African. And I'm also taking into consideration the indigenous populations that lived on those islands as well, right? Their interactions with and their genocide at the hands of colonizers diminished their numbers, but alongside that, many of them would flee and live in isolation, and many of them would also marry or have relationships with some of the African slaves who were brought there. So at particular points in time, there would be numbers as large as 20, sometimes 25, sometimes even 30 enslaved African people to one white person. This was such a staggering and scary number for the Europeans at the time that they began to issue out laws that stated that there couldn't be no larger than, on some islands, 10 to 1, in Jamaica, for example, no larger than 20 Africans for every one European. And they would encourage Europeans to seek out other Europeans, go to Ireland, go to Scotland, go to France, go to England, go to Spain, and hire Europeans to work and to work on your plantation so that we can increase that number. Of course, humid. If any of us have ever been to or are from the islands, from the West Indies, then we know that it is very humid, mountainous terrain, and folks lived in isolation because you lived on islands. And so these experiences for African women allowed them to preserve various aspects of African culture and encourage resistance more frequently than perhaps some of the other places in the Americas. There were oftentimes like majority female plantations. So in Barbados, for example, between the 710s and 730s, there was a higher population of women than there were men. And this is, we could say the same for different periods in time on various different islands, largely the British and the French colonized islands. House girls were taboo. They were seen as whores who entered the home to ravish the men. So many, for several years in the early 1600s through the late 1600s and sometimes early 1700s, there were very few women who lived or who did like domestic work in the homes because there was this fear from some of the European women, right? And then there was some intentional hostile intracommunal relationships. These existed with slave drivers, the gens de couleur, who are the free people of color who existed in the French colonies. There were even some intentional hostile relationships between maroons and some of the enslaved folks, and of course, men and women. These were relationships, or these were like intentionally made hostile by colonizers to ensure that there will always be division. Women who produce low and who reproduce low or not at all were sold to poor whites or were sent to different islands. And lastly, different colonizers and different laws. Different colonizers meant that you needed to acclimate to different laws. So you would be colonized by France for about 100 years, and then perhaps the British for 50 years, and then maybe even the Spanish for another 50 years, and those laws and rules shifted slightly. And I have a photograph here of the gens de couleur. So at first glance, you may think that these are wealthy white women with African servants, but these are the fair-skinned, multiracial or biracial, sometimes 1/16th, 1/32, 1/64th Black, and these women experience a set of privileges and a set of freedom, and they even have their own servants, right? So they were not white, but they were in their own set of classes. And those classes would shift and maneuver depending on how white they were, right? How much white blood was in their bodies. And these are 3 different flyers for 3 different things. We have the Black codes in France. These codes were set to not only set limitations for the enslaved Africans, but also for the freed Africans or gens de couleur, right? In the middle, there is a wanted sign for Negro drivers. So they would actually hire slave drivers who were Black to enforce, right? Slave drivers are overseers, right? To enforce the laws and to enforce slavery on other African people, a form of division. And here is a narration of a West Indian slave girl by the name of Mary Prince. And they would use these narrations during time of abolition, similar to the United States, right? To gain the sympathy of other white people who were on the fence about as to whether or not they wanted to abolish slavery, et cetera, et cetera. So, who were the maroons? This is an opportunity for you all to type this in the chat box. Do we know who the maroons were? Do we have any understanding of their history? If you do, please leave it in the chat box. All right, no idea. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know. So, maroons, they were the Africans who escaped slavery and they fled to the mountainous regions of the land. These communities were like really close-knit enclaves, and they maintained futile relationships with European colonizers and enslavers. So the Africans, the Afro-Caribbean people who escaped slavery would flee to the mountainous regions. And if you are familiar with the geography of the Caribbean islands, there are various different terrains on every island. So you may have an area that is very flat, that is typically where the plantations and the cities and the towns and all of that would be, but you would have woodsy areas and mountains that were very difficult, very harsh climate, very harsh terrain, right? And many of the Africans, having the knowledge of land being from the continent, right, were able to escape and go to these parts of the Caribbean islands, and they would have very little contact with the Europeans because the Europeans could not navigate those areas as easily as the Africans were able to. So there's different ways that you can, different names that you'll see throughout history, but they're talking about the same group of people. And maroons existed on just about every island that I have researched. All 28 islands have some mentions of, some sort of mentioning of maroons. They may call them something different. It may be the name for them in a different language, but every island where there were enslaved people, there were also maroons. Queen Nani of the Maroons, and in parentheses, I have the name, the original name of the island of Jamaica. Queen Nani was born in 1686, and she passed in 1733. She was born in Ghana, and she was brought to Jamaica as an enslaved African. She and her brothers, upon arrival, attempted several times to escape, to leave the plantation. And there was an instance in which they were successful. They fled to the Blue Mountains. She became a military strategist and defeated the British in several battles. She was so successful and so skillful in her military tactics that the British would oftentimes end in a truce, or they would literally withdraw their troops. So their troops would die from the temperatures, the humidity, from the terrain, from not being able to navigate that part of the islands, because they were in the mountains battling. And on top of that, she was so skilled that she had so many different military tactics and so many different ways that she would teach her military to attack. So at one point, she had over 1,000 maroons, 600 women and children, and 300 men. So all of the maroons in Jamaica practiced military tactics. This was not something that was done solely by the men. The women and the children would also engage in military warfare. And this is a photograph of the Jamaican currency. The highest currency is 500, and Queen Nani of Jamaica, of Jamaican Maroons, is on the $500 bill in Jamaica. Do we have any questions, any thoughts, any ideas thus far? Let me go to the chat box and take a quick look. All right, I'll give it like 5 more seconds and then we are going to 3, 2, 1. Okay, so this case study, I am going to examine 3 women and their contributions, and I'm doing this for the sake of time. These women will all be from islands that were colonized by the French. I did this intentionally so that the history of what was happening would be a bit more cohesive. But I am examining 3 women, and they all have 3 different things to offer. So the first one, spirituality. This is Haiti or Haiti. You will see the indigenous name of the island first, and you will see the colonized name of the island in parentheses. And this is the theme, the form of resistance that before the colon, right? So spirituality, Haiti or Haiti. Cecile Fatiman of Haiti. She lived from 1771 to 1883, and no, that is not a typo. She lived for 112 years, allegedly. She was the daughter of a white slave master and an African slave woman. She was a voodoo priestess, a mambo, the highest ranking of like the spirituality possible. So mambo, she was a voodoo priestess, and of course they have voodoo priests would be the Hugans, and she was the highest ranking here, right? In 1971, or in 1791, she had a prophetic vision, right? She prophesied that enslaved Africans of Haiti would revolt and inherit the land, and her voodoo ceremony will spark the her voodoo ceremony would be the thing that sparked the revolution. So the revolts led to the revolution, and the revolution led to Haiti's independence, the first free Black or independent Black nation in the Western world that we have knowledge of, right? So why is this important? Why is her form of resistance so crucial? Well, in voodoo, right? In voodoo, her role as a priestess was the highest position, one of the highest positions, highest rankings in her spiritual practice. This is taboo because African spiritualities were forbidden by colonizers. And part of the reason why the colonizers forbade this particular religion was not only because they wanted to reinforce Catholicism or Christianity, but because there was a spiritual there was an understanding of a spiritual balance, a balance of all things. So men and women, good and bad, light and darkness, right? There was an understanding that there was a balance. There was not an hierarchy, where one thing reigned over the other, but that things will always maintain and regain its balance. So anything that was out of whack, right, such as enslavement and colonization, will have to be forced back into balance. And her blood sacrifice, if you look over to the right, she slit the throat of the pig. The pig represented the colonizers, and the blood represented the bloodshed that the colonizers would have to spill so that indigenous folks and the Africans on the islands could be free. The second woman, bodily autonomy. So I'm going to be focusing on the ways in which women's bodies did not belong to them, and how their reproductive rights did not belong to them either. And this is the form of resistance that was utilized to regain that. Cara, Guadalupe. This is the mulatto Solitude. She was born in 1772, and she died in was murdered in 1802. There are questions as to whether or not she was born in 1772. Historians have argued that she could have possibly been born in 1780, but there are documentations of a mulatto by the name of Solitude from 1772, hence the question mark. So Solitude was conceived on a slave ship by a French sailor and an enslaved African woman. And as a mulatto woman with colored eyes, she was hidden from the overseers and eventually taken from her mother and moved into a different social status. So one thing that I want you all to understand is that particularly within the French colonies, right, the islands that were colonized by the French, there was a ranking of people based on their bloodline, right? So if you had a white father, or if you perhaps were only 1/4 or 1/8 or 1/16 Black, your ranking, your social status would increase. Even if you maintained a slave, your social status on the plantation legally, right, would increase, or you would be able to climb a social ladder, so to speak. And when Solitude's mother came to landed, when the ship sailed and landed itself on the coast of Haiti, she began to understand that what she would potentially give birth to would be removed from her. She being an African and that child being a mulatto child, a biracial child. So she hid her child for several years, but eventually, of course, that child would have to work the fields and she would be seen by overseers and the slave master. So her daughter was taken from her. And this is arguably, through the eyes of historians, what sparked something in the mother, right? We don't want to use the modern language, but this is something that sparked the mother's desire to run away. And that's exactly what she did. She left and she became a maroon. She fled to the hills, and she became a maroon in Guadalupe. She left her daughter there, understanding that her daughter would live a somewhat better life, right, than she had lived. And during this time, slavery was temporarily abolished. The Haitian Revolution and what was going on during that time forced slavery to be abolished, at least for 8 years. And during this time, Solitude was free, but we call it today free-ish, meaning that they were still indentured servants. They were still working the fields and not being paid, but slave masters were a little less hesitant to be as brutal to the slaves due to the fact that they saw what was going on in Haiti, and they were afraid that those rebellions would spark on every island. So they told them that they were free, but they really weren't free, right? They were just slaves with a nicer slave master. And after slavery was reinstated by Napoleon Bonaparte, she fled. Solitude fled as well and became a maroon. She joined a small group of maroons who would declare themselves a military, right? And and they took up arms. She was 5 to 6 months pregnant at the time when she decided that she would also take up arms. She rose in military ranks, and they marched to the plantation that she once lived on, as well as several other plantations, and killed her slave owner and several of the colonizers, dozens of the colonizers, as well as some of the soldiers from Napoleon's military. She was captured on the 18th day of her battle because she was wounded by a cannonball. And to punish her, they reinstated slavery, and they declared her unborn child a slave. So as opposed to executing her or killing her on the spot, they kept her alive and they kept her fed to make sure that she would give birth to a healthy baby. And the day after her child was born, she was tortured and executed. So literally a day after her child's birth, her child was sent to the plantation from which she was born and raised to become a slave, and she was tortured and executed. And why is this important? This is important because this speaks to the bodily autonomy or lack thereof that women fought tooth and nail for daily on the islands and all throughout the Americas. Her child was not hers. Her mother's child was not hers, right? Her mother's body did not belong to her. And so this form of resistance is important for us to recognize, because this woman took up arms and she battled 6 months pregnant, knowing that she could potentially injure not only herself, but her child, for the opportunity for herself and her child to be free. Her alleged last words were freedom or death. And here I have a monument in Guadeloupe of the mulatto solitude. And right next to it, I just have a breakdown of the island and the several cities within the island. So this monument was presented in the late 90s and then represented in the early 2000s. There was a lot of controversy. There were several people, of course, who applauded and celebrated the symbolism of this. But however, of course, whenever we present monuments of our true revolutionaries, there's always resistance, there's always backlash. And the last one, I want to speak on militancy. I have a very difficult time pronouncing St. Lucia's indigenous name, so I will let you read it, but this is the indigenous name of St. Lucia. So last story, Flore Boy Gaillard. And I do not speak French, once again, so there are several ways that you could pronounce her name. This woman was also born a mulatto. Her story, her childhood upbringing, and the story of her mother is a mystery and has remained a mystery to many of the historians. She experienced repeated counts of rape and other forms of violence. And at one point, of course, as many revolutionary women, she decided that that was something that she would no longer withstand. And she fled, became a maroon in the island of St. Lucia. There she sharpened her revolutionary consciousness, right? She was introduced to people who were formerly enslaved, or folks who were born and lived their entire lives as free maroon people. And in the 1790s, she rose to become a military leader in a French army. So this army was called the French Army of the Woods. They were literally the militia men and women of St. Lucia, who were the Maroons. So the French at this time were trying to reinstate their claims to the land, to that island, because the British had seized that land during the 7 Years' War. And so they armed several of the Maroons and had the Maroons assist them in battling the British so that the French could become the colonizers of that island again. Very interesting, but a reality, right? Her army would join the French in the first Brigands War, and she defeated the British in 1795. She led her military to the former plantation that she lived on. She burned the property down. She freed the enslaved people, and she murdered her former slave master, several overseers, and the slave master's families, as well as, of course, the British soldiers who were guarding the area. She would lead the men and women in her military into various battles against the British, and her military skills and expertise would contribute to the year of freedom from slavery. So there was a literal year in St. Lucia in which they were all emancipated, temporarily, of course, right? They were all emancipated, and there were very few plantation owners or slave masters, slave owners, right, and overseers, because they were transitioning from British reign back to a French reign. So the French tricked them, made them believe that they would be free while they sorted things out and divided the land and then reclaimed it. So why did I choose these particular women? These women, like many other Afro-Caribbean women, were at the forefront of liberation in the colonial West Indies. These women were not only active participants, but they were foremothers, right? These women were not only in the military, not only a part of the revolution, right? But they led the revolution, or they sparked ignited the flames of the revolution. And these are women who are also in many ways noted and celebrated in their respective countries. But I do want to be mindful and attentive to the realities that there were many women who were left unnamed, uncelebrated, and unwritten. There are so many women in our history books that have no names, no faces, no identities, and no backstories. But we're doing this work day in and day out. We're doing this work prior to these four women, and we're doing this work after these four women. So I have wrapped up my presentation for you all. I wanted to make sure that we left some time for a conversation. Do we have any questions or thoughts? I would like to know how you all felt hearing about those women. Were these women that you knew about prior to this presentation? Were there some interesting things that you learned? Were there some unanswered questions that you maybe have about these women or the history in general?
My goodness, I'll definitely, I don't have a question in particular, but I'll definitely start just by expressing gratitude and appreciation, just to you, Sister Jada, for your thoroughness in producing and presenting scholarship on this level. It's, you know, everything that we do at the African Black Coalition is done with intention, and that certainly applied to our political education. And so we are sure to cover many of the topics and time periods and historical figures that would never be covered on any college campus, or would never be covered in, you know, materials or books that are at least, you know, readily accessible, right? We do our best to find out how to organize and teach that political education that may be obscure, right? In our collective consciousness, right? And that's done, right, you know, through a variety of systematic methods, of course, and it's our job to counter that with our own thorough political education. So I would definitely, again, extend my appreciation and gratitude to you. If there are any questions or comments that we may have, I saw a couple of them in the chat just now. But so what I'll definitely do is this presentation will be made available to all the participants, as well as this Zoom recording, because, you know, we're all about making the information as accessible as possible. John Henrik Clarke taught us that all the knowledge in the world belongs to everybody in the world. So that's, a part of our job. So if there are no questions or comments or anything like that, no further questions or comments, I'll just like to say peace and Black power to you, Sister Jada. Peace and Black power to our participants. And this has wrapped up what has definitely been a profound political education experience with this hard teaching series, right? We're definitely not done in terms of organizing and teaching our people. That's our primary responsibility, right? So again, peace and Black power to you, Jada, to the participants. With that, I am Makonnen Tendaji, the Political Education Director for the African Black Coalition. Peace, ready for revolution.
Thank you so much.